Some places don't get wiped out in a single afternoon. There's no explosion, no headline event, no one moment you can point to. Instead, the ground just gets a little too hot, or the water creeps a little too high, or the dirt turns out to be a little too poisonous, and one day, everybody who lived there is just gone, and nobody's allowed back. No dramatic goodbye, just moving trucks and government paperwork. So let's get into 13 places in America humans were forced to abandon forever. Number 13. Kaho'olawe, Hawaii. Kaho'olawe is a small island off the coast of Maui, and for centuries it was considered sacred ground by native Hawaiians, tied to the sea god Kanaloa. By the early 1900s, it was mostly used for cattle ranching, leased out to families for about $1 a year, which in hindsight is one of the worst deals in American real estate history. The day after Pearl Harbor was attacked in December 1941, the Navy declared martial law across Hawaii, and Kaho'olawe was swallowed whole into the war effort. The ranchers were told to leave, and they never came back. What followed was decades of the island being used as a live-fire training range. Bombs, rockets, napalm, ship-to-shore shelling, submarines firing torpedoes at the cliffs. If the military had a weapon, there's a decent chance it got tested on this island at some point. In 1965, things escalated in a way that's almost funny if it wasn't so destructive. The Navy ran a series of tests called Sailor Hat, where they detonated 3 separate piles of 500 tons of TNT each, just to simulate what a nuclear blast would do to a ship sitting nearby. One of those blasts cracked the island's underground freshwater aquifer, letting seawater seep in and ruining the island's ability to hold fresh water at all. For a while, the Navy's official explanation for the island's erosion problems was that it was caused by wild goats, not the multi-decade bombing campaign. Goats. By the 1970s, native Hawaiian activists had had enough. In 1976, a group calling themselves the Protect Kaho'olawe, Ohana, began occupying the island in protest, risking arrest to physically stand on land they weren't supposed to touch. In 1977, 2 of the activists, George Helm and Kimo Mitchell, disappeared at sea while trying to reach the island and were never found. Their deaths turned the protest into a national story, and the pressure eventually worked. Bombing finally stopped in 1990, and in 1993, Congress transferred the island back to the state of Hawaii, along with $400 million to fund a cleanup. That cleanup is still going. Unexploded ordnance is still scattered across the island, which means Kaho'olawe remains uninhabited today, with access limited almost entirely to cultural and restoration crews trying to bring native vegetation back to a landscape that spent half a century being used as a bullseye. Archaeologists who surveyed the island after the military finally left found more than 500 historic and cultural sites still intact underneath all that damage, including old shrines, quarries, and petroglyphs, which is a strange kind of good news buried inside an otherwise pretty grim story. It's a reminder that even a place used as a bombing range for decades doesn't stop being someone's ancestral home the whole time it's happening. Number 12. St. Thomas, Nevada. St. Thomas started in 1865 as a small Mormon farming settlement along the Muddy and Virgin Rivers in the far southeast corner of Nevada. At its peak, it had around 500 residents, a school, several stores, a church, and, notably, an ice cream parlor, which for a desert outpost in the 1800s was basically a 5-star amenity. The town's real problem showed up in 1928, when Congress authorized construction of the Hoover Dam. Once the dam went up and Lake Mead began filling in 1935, the water had nowhere to go but up, and St. Thomas sat right in its path. Residents were paid, though not particularly generously, for land that was about to disappear under a reservoir. Some people dismantled their houses board by board and hauled them off to higher ground. Others just left everything standing and walked away. The town's last holdout was a man named Hugh Lord, who reportedly waited until the water reached his own front porch, set his house on fire, and rode off in a boat. By June of 1938, St. Thomas was completely underwater, at some points buried more than 60 feet below the surface of the lake. Here's the part that makes St. Thomas different from most places on this list. It didn't stay under. Lake Mead's water levels rise and fall with drought cycles, and every so often the town has poked back up out of the water like it's checking to see if the coast is clear. It resurfaced briefly in 1945 and again in 1963. And since a prolonged southwest drought began drying up the reservoir in the early 2000s, St. Thomas has stayed exposed continuously, its old foundations, roads, and even the ice cream parlor's chimney now sitting out in the open along a hiking trail inside Lake Mead National Recreation Area. It's a rare case of a ghost town coming back to haunt the very thing that killed it. Number 11. Love Canal, New York. Love Canal sits in Niagara Falls, and its story starts, appropriately, with an actual unfinished canal. In the 1940s and early 1950s, the Hooker Chemical Company used the old canal trench as a dump site, burying roughly 21,000 tons of chemical waste in steel drums and covering it with clay and dirt. In 1953, the company sold the land to the local school board for $1, along with a written warning about the buried chemicals, and then the school board went ahead and built an elementary school directly on top of it anyway. Homes followed shortly after, hundreds of them, ringing the old dump site in a quiet, ordinary suburban neighborhood. For about 2 decades, nothing seemed obviously wrong, aside from some odd chemical smells and the occasional patch of dead grass. Then, in the late 1970s, heavy rains raised the water table, and the chemicals started working their way up. Residents began finding black sludge oozing into basements, chemical puddles forming in backyards, and corroded metal drums surfacing in the schoolyard where kids played. A local resident named Lois Gibbs, whose own son had developed health problems, organized her neighbors into the Love Canal Homeowners Association and pushed the story into the national spotlight. In 1978, President Carter declared a federal emergency, evacuating families closest to the canal. 2 years later, after further investigation into contamination spreading beyond the immediate site, a second, wider emergency declaration cleared out most of the remaining neighborhood, ultimately relocating around 900 families in total. Love Canal became the case that launched the modern era of American environmental cleanup law. It's the direct reason Congress passed the Superfund law in 1980, creating a system to hold polluters financially responsible and fund cleanups of contaminated sites nationwide. The neighborhood itself was fenced off, demolished in sections, and has spent decades since as a cautionary tale taught in environmental science classes, which is a strange legacy for what used to just be someone's street. Number 10. Picher, Oklahoma. Picher got its start in 1913 after a drilling accident on tribal land accidentally struck one of the richest lead and zinc deposits in the world. The town exploded in population almost overnight, and at its peak during the World War era, Picher and the surrounding tri-state mining district were producing over half the lead used in American bullets during World War I, with zinc production continuing to feed the war effort straight through World War II. The mining boom left behind a landscape reshaped by chat, the mountains of crushed, contaminated waste rock left over from ore processing. Nobody thought much of it at the time. Kids rode bikes on the chat piles. Families used it as gravel for driveways. Some of it even ended up under playgrounds. The problem was that this waste rock was loaded with lead, and by the time anyone realized the scale of the exposure, it was already inside the bodies of a generation of children. A 1996 blood lead survey found that well over a third of tested children in Picher had elevated lead levels, and in the neighboring community of Cardin, that number hit 63%. In 1983, the EPA designated the area the Tar Creek Superfund site, one of the largest and most contaminated in the country, and buyout offers slowly started rolling out to residents. Even with that, plenty of longtime residents refused to leave. Then, on May 10, 2008, an EF4 tornado tore straight through town, killing 6 people and destroying well over 100 homes in minutes. For a community that had already been crumbling for years, it was the final push. Nearly everyone who was left accepted a federal buyout in the aftermath. Picher's population had been over 1,600 in the 2000 census. By 2010, it was down to 20. In 2009, the town formally dissolved its incorporation, and demolition crews spent the following years tearing down what remained of a place that once produced the metal that armed 2 world wars. Number 9. Times Beach, Missouri. Times Beach began in the 1920s as a small resort town along the newly designated Route 66, a place where working families from St. Louis could rent a cheap lot along the river for the summer. It never had much of a tax base, and by the 1970s the town couldn't even afford to pave its own roads. That budget problem is what led to disaster. To keep the dust down on those unpaved streets, the town hired a waste hauler who sprayed the roads with used oil between 1971 and 1976. What nobody realized at the time was that the oil was contaminated with dioxin, a byproduct tied to herbicide and chemical manufacturing and considered one of the more dangerous compounds studied at the time. The contamination stayed mostly hidden until December 1982, when the Merrimack River flooded the entire town, spreading dioxin-laced soil into yards, homes, and the local park. Testing afterward found dioxin levels that were, in some spots, hundreds of times higher than what federal health officials considered safe. On December 23, 1982, residents were told their entire town was contaminated. Panic followed almost immediately, with every illness and every dead pet suddenly getting blamed on dioxin exposure. President Reagan assembled a federal task force to deal with the fallout, and on February 22, 1983, the EPA announced a full buyout of Times Beach. Roughly 2,400 residents relocated using tens of millions of dollars in Superfund money. The entire town was later demolished in 1992, and, after an incinerator was built to burn the contaminated soil, the land was eventually turned into what is now Route 66 State Park. Some officials later admitted the danger may have been overstated, which is a strange thing to say to a town you already paid to disappear. By the time federal investigators had finished their work, they'd traced the same contaminated oil hauler to dozens of other dump sites scattered across Missouri, meaning Times Beach wasn't actually an isolated accident so much as the one location where the consequences happened to become impossible to ignore. Number 8. Holland Island, Maryland. Holland Island once sat in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay, and around 1910 it was home to more than 360 people, complete with a schoolhouse, a church, a post office, and even a baseball team that traveled by boat to play games against nearby Smith Island. Watermen built sturdy Victorian homes along the island's central ridge and made a living harvesting oysters and crabs from the surrounding waters. The problem was what the island was made of. Unlike a lot of coastal land, Holland Island had no bedrock underneath it, just soft silt and clay, which meant it eroded easily under wave action and rising water. Serious erosion set in around 1914, and families began disassembling their homes, board by board, loading them onto boats, and rebuilding on the Maryland mainland in towns like Crisfield and Cambridge. Most residents were gone by 1918, and by 1922, even the seasonal fishermen who'd been sticking around had left for good, taking the local church building with them. For decades after that, the island slowly kept shrinking, until all that remained was one house, a Victorian home built around 1888, standing alone on a rapidly disappearing patch of land. Its owner spent years piling rocks and sandbags around the foundation, trying to hold back a bay that had already claimed the rest of the island around him. He eventually gave up. In October 2010, after a severe storm, the house finally cracked and collapsed into the water. Today, there's essentially nothing left above the surface at high tide, just a patch of marsh grass and, occasionally, some old gravestones poking through the mud. Number 7. Elkmont, Tennessee. Elkmont started life as a logging town, built up in the early 1900s to house workers cutting timber in the mountains of eastern Tennessee. When the logging operation wound down, Wealthy families from Knoxville discovered the area was a beautiful place to spend the summer, and two private clubs, the Appalachian Club and the Wonderland Park Club, built rows of rustic vacation cabins along the Little River. Everything changed in 1934 when the federal government established the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Elkmont sat right inside the new park boundary, and the National Park Service used eminent domain to acquire the land. But rather than force everyone out immediately, the Park Service offered many cabin owners lifetime leases, letting them keep using their vacation homes for years, and in some cases decades, after the park officially existed around them. Those leases eventually expired, the last of them stretching into the early 2000s, and once they did, families packed up and left for the final time. What they left behind wasn't demolished right away. Instead, dozens of cabins sat quietly decaying in the forest for years, wood siding rotting, porches collapsing, nature slowly folding the buildings back into the landscape. Eventually, the Park Service decided some of the more historically significant cabins were worth saving rather than losing entirely, and restoration work has preserved a portion of Elkmont as a kind of open-air museum, a genuine ghost town tucked inside one of the most visited national parks in the country. Number 6. Thurmond, West Virginia. Thurmond was built around coal and the railroad that hauled it, sitting deep in the New River Gorge in southern West Virginia. During the early 1900s, it was one of the busiest freight stations on the entire Chesapeake and Ohio railway line, moving enormous volumes of coal out of the region every single day. For a while, the town's bank reportedly did more business than any other branch in the state. The decline started gradually and then accelerated. As railroads shifted from coal-fired steam locomotives to diesel engines after World War II, Thurmond's entire economic reason for existing quietly evaporated. Coal traffic through the region also slowed as the industry contracted over the following decades. Businesses closed one by one, and families moved on to find work elsewhere, leaving storefronts and homes standing empty along the narrow strip of land squeezed between the river and the mountainside. Thurmond never had a single dramatic evacuation like some of the other places on this list. It just slowly emptied out over the better part of a century, and today it holds the distinction of being one of the smallest incorporated towns in the entire country, with a population that's hovered in the single digits for years. It's now part of the New River Gorge National Park, and visitors can walk past the old depot and the rows of quiet buildings, most of which are preserved but essentially unoccupied, remnants of a boomtown that ran out of a reason to keep going. Number 5. Kennecott, Alaska. Kennecott was built by the Kennecott Copper Corporation after prospectors discovered an extraordinarily rich copper deposit high in the mountains of what's now Wrangell St. Elias National Park in 1900. The company built an entire self-contained town around the mine starting in 1911, complete with a hospital, a school, a general store, and a massive mill perched on the mountainside to process the ore. For nearly 3 decades, Kennecott was one of the richest copper mining operations in the world. But by the late 1930s, the richest veins had finally been exhausted. The company's response was almost brutally efficient. In November 1938, Kennecott simply shut everything down and left, loading workers and their families onto the last train out with only a few hours' notice. Equipment was left where it sat, furniture stayed in the buildings, and paperwork remained in the offices, because nobody planned on this being a long-term stop for anyone ever again. Because the site was so remote, it wasn't looted or torn apart the way most abandoned towns eventually are. It just sat there, frozen, for decades, gradually weathering in the Alaskan climate while almost nobody visited. Eventually, the site's historical value was recognized, and it was designated a National Historic Landmark. The National Park Service has since stabilized many of the original buildings, and today, visitors can walk through a mining town that was essentially abandoned overnight and left almost exactly as it stood the day the last train pulled away. Number 4. Bodie, California. Bodie started as a small gold mining camp in the 1860s, but it exploded into a full boom town after a mine collapse in 1876 accidentally exposed a rich new gold vein. Within a few years, Bodie's population had swelled to somewhere between 7 and 10,000 people, and the town developed a reputation as one of the wildest, most lawless places in the American West, with a murder rate that local legend claims averaged close to one a day during its rowdiest stretch. There's a popular, if unverified, story about a young girl whose family was moving to Bodie who supposedly wrote in her diary, "Goodbye, God, I'm going to Bodie." Historians can't confirm it's real, but it stuck around because it fit the town's reputation perfectly. The gold, like it always does, eventually ran out. Mining slowed through the early 1900s, and two major fires, one in 1892 and another in 1932, destroyed large sections of the business district, giving residents less and less reason to rebuild. By the 1940s, Bodie's population had dwindled to almost nothing, and the last mining operations shut down for good not long after. What makes Bodie unusual is what happened next. Nothing. The town wasn't demolished or looted into oblivion. It was eventually designated a California State Historic Park in 1962, and the state adopted a policy of arrested decay, meaning buildings are structurally maintained just enough to keep them from collapsing, but nothing is restored or rebuilt. Dishes still sit on tables inside abandoned homes. Shelves in the old general store are still stocked. It's less a ghost town you visit and more a moment in time that just stopped moving forward. Number 3. Gilman, Colorado. Gilman sits high on Battle Mountain in Eagle County, and it started out in 1886 as a silver mining camp during Colorado's silver boom. When silver prices collapsed later that century, the town pivoted to zinc, lead, and copper, and eventually became a company town run entirely by the New Jersey Zinc Company, which owned essentially everything in Gilman, including the houses people lived in. At its peak, Gilman supported around 1,500 to 2,000 residents, and the Eagle mine beneath the town produced millions of tons of ore over roughly a century of operation. But that century of extraction came with a cost. Mining waste, containing heavy metals like lead, zinc, and cadmium, had been accumulating for decades, eventually totaling around 8 million tons, and it had been steadily contaminating the groundwater beneath the town the entire time. In 1984, the mine finally shut down for good, and shortly after, the EPA stepped in, citing dangerous levels of toxic pollutants in the water supply. Evacuation began in 1985, and by 1986, the last residents were gone. That same year, the site was formally designated a Superfund cleanup location. Unlike some ghost towns, Gilman was never opened back up to the public. The land remains privately owned to this day, fenced off and actively patrolled against trespassers, though you can still see the town's rows of empty buildings clinging to the mountainside from the highway pullouts below, a strange, half-modern skyline with nobody left to occupy it. Number 2. Buffalo Creek, West Virginia. Buffalo Creek wasn't one town, but a string of 16 small coal camp communities packed along a narrow valley in Logan County, home to around 5,000 people. Upstream, the Pittston Coal Company had built a series of coal slurry impoundments, essentially dams made of packed mining waste, stacked one on top of another over the course of a decade, with the newest one built directly on top of the leftover sludge from the one before it. There was reportedly no formal engineering plan behind any of it, just a rough sketch drawn up by an on-site company vice president. After several days of heavy rain in February 1972, water levels behind the highest dam rose dangerously, despite repeated warnings from residents and even some company staff. On the morning of February 26, 1972, that dam gave way. Roughly 130 million gallons of water and thick black coal sludge crashed downhill, tearing through the two lower impoundments and then straight through the valley below. In under 3 hours, the wave of sludge and debris tore through community after community, ripping homes off their foundations and sweeping away cars, bridges, and railroad track along the way. By the time it reached the Gyandat River 15 miles downstream, 125 people were dead, more than 1,100 were injured, and over 4,000 people had lost their homes entirely. In its own legal filings afterward, Pittston Cole referred to the disaster as an act of God, which is quite a claim to make about a stack of homemade dams. Many of the 16 communities were never rebuilt at all, and survivors were relocated permanently, closing out one of the deadliest industrial disasters in American history. The disaster also changed federal policy, prompting new inspections of coal waste impoundments across the country and a wave of hearings in Congress over how a private company had been allowed to stack unengineered waste dams directly above thousands of people's homes for over a decade without any real oversight. Number 1. Centralia, Pennsylvania. Centralia's story starts almost embarrassingly small. On May 27, 1962, local firefighters set fire to the town landfill to clean it up ahead of the Memorial Day holiday, which was standard practice at the time. The landfill happened to sit inside an old strip mining pit, and one leftover opening into the abandoned coal mine tunnels beneath it hadn't been properly sealed. The fire wasn't fully extinguished, and it found its way down into that opening, and from there, into a coal seam running straight underneath the entire town. For the next 2 decades, the fire crept slowly through the maze of abandoned anthracite mine tunnels beneath Centralia, more or less unnoticed by anyone outside town. That changed in the early 1980s, when residents began noticing carbon monoxide seeping into basements and the ground itself literally opening up. In 1981, a 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski was in his backyard when the ground gave way beneath him, and he nearly fell into a steaming sinkhole that was later measured at over 150 feet deep. He managed to grab onto a tree root and pull himself out, but the incident made national news and forced officials to finally take the danger seriously. In 1983, Congress approved roughly $42 million to relocate residents and demolish their properties. Most of the roughly 1,000 people still living in Centralia accepted buyouts throughout the rest of the decade. By 1992, the state of Pennsylvania invoked eminent domain over the entire borough, condemning virtually every remaining building. A small number of holdout residents fought the condemnation order in court for years, and a handful were eventually allowed to stay in their homes for the rest of their lives under a legal settlement. One of the last lifelong residents, John Lakaitis Jr., lived in Centralia from birth until he was finally evicted from his family's home in 2009. Asked about it afterward, he said simply, "I never had any desire to move. It was my home." Route 61, which used to run straight through town, was closed off in 1993 after sinkholes and steam vents made the road unsafe to drive. The abandoned mile-long stretch became a strange tourist attraction covered in decades of graffiti, nicknamed Graffiti Highway, until the state finally buried it under dirt in 2020 to keep people from visiting. Centralia's population, once around 1,000, was down to just 5 people by the most recent census. Geologists estimate the underground fire has enough fuel to keep burning for up to 250 more years, which means, in a very real sense, Centralia is still being actively destroyed, just too slowly for most of us to notice. 13 places, 13 completely different reasons. A fire, a flood, a bomb range, a bad batch of chemicals sprayed on a dirt road, and somehow they all end the same way. The people leave, the paperwork gets filed, and the place just sits there afterward, half remembered, mostly empty, waiting for nobody in particular. If you liked this one, hit like, subscribe for more of these, and let me know in the comments which one of these surprised you the most. See you in the next video.